Okay, we're going to look at a long dress, which is one of the objects in Gertrude Stein's famous work, Tender Buttons. All right, how comfortable are you, Emily, with things that don't seem to mean easily?
I guess I'll find out.
Oh, you will? Okay, that's a very politician-like response. Molly, typically in your life, how comfortable are you when you see something when you read something that's seemingly incomprehensible?
Not at all.
You're not at all comfortable. So we're what's the word? Pushing you out of your comfort zone.
Yes.
Okay. A long dress. This is actually in your comfort zone. A long dress. A long dress. So in the first line, we have the word current. What is the current that makes machinery? Okay? Okay, Anna, current. What could current be? We've seen this word in this course.
Current could be electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Current could be like the power of water.
Or anything that pushes along.
Current could
Kind
be,
of has an inevitability, an inexorability about it. Keep going.
Current could be like a wave of thought.
Okay, that's a hard one. Very unusual. You're like a walking OED. Can you do the fourth one? Anybody, a fourth connotation that's probably a little easier than that third one. Molly?
Like contemporary?
Contemporariness. Current as in currency. And I gave away the fifth. Currency. We think of currency as value. Yeah? So currency as in dollars and coins. Value. So current is a relative of that. Okay, so that's good. We've got current. What is the current that makes machinery? What does this have to do with a long dress? This is an object. Amaris?
Well, I read it metapoetically, so I saw that current.
Already? Okay,
Well,
that's fine.
Yes, because it's talking about dress and then it goes to a current.
Can we hold off on the metapoetic just a little? Be a little more literal?
Sure.
You know, Gertrude Stein...
Oh, it's a domestic object.
No, but because if you're uncomfortable, you know, as Molly admitted she is, with things that don't make sense, and you're armed with the idea of metapoetry, then you can get away from close reading. Mm-hmm. You know, Marjorie Perloff, who's really good on Gertrude Stein, has taught me over the years that we shouldn't shy away from trying to do close readings of poems that don't seem to make sense at all. I'm not saying that that's characteristic of you, but I do think it is a little easy to jump to the metapoetic right away. So I invite you to be a little more, literal isn't quite the right word, but grappling with the words and phrases.
All right. So the presents a long line and a necessary waist could reference the title in that a dress.
Waist, as in waistline.
A dress has a circumference, a style, a form. It implies constraint. It changes with the times in fashion, but not necessarily in the gender relations that it limits people to.
Cool. Great. Allie, what does it mean in the context of a poem called A Long Dress, or in the context of the making of a long dress, to ask, what is this current? What are some paraphrasings of that not quite question, because she doesn't put a question mark after it?
Well, I mean, immediately I just kind of think of the way that the dress might flow.
Flow, current is flow. Wow. That's a second level answer. Is there a simpler one, Max? You know a lot about fashion.
Well, if we generated some meanings already for current, the electricity connotation, of course, works with machinery. If we think of a sewing machine.
Paraphrase the question. What is this current?
Well, it could either be an electric current or it could also be.
So ask the question. What is this? What's she saying in effect? What is this electricity?
Or what is this? I mean, it seems to be modern, because if we think of electricity and sewing machines, that's modern, and so is the idea of fashion. And if we go back to the currency, contemporary association with current, then they sort of work hand in hand, and we see
cool.
The making of this dress, actually, with a sewing machine, and also
the making of the dress.
Wait,
did you just say the making of this dress?
Yes. I mean, if we think of Stein as being,
if we think of Stein as being
interested in the composition of objects or the creation of objects, then we have a very literal creation of this dress.
And
here.
she's interested in the conditions, linguistic and otherwise, which give rise to an object, which is to say a linguistic, language-based understanding of the way our world, the way we see things in the world. What better way than to consider a long dress with its in fashion, with its relevance to currency? I don't know enough about the history of fashion to know if in 1913, 1914, a long dress is maybe just a little bit not current, or maybe in fact quite current. I haven't seen a photograph of Gertrude Stein wearing a short dress. Not that I want this to be autobiographical in the least, but she's considering the currency of a long dress. And so the conditions of manufacture, what is the current that makes this machinery? What kind of question is that? If you're a Dave, you be our Marxist for a second. If it's the teens and we're producing clothing, this is prior to the is it the shirtwaist factory fire?
Yeah.
Would that be relevant? That's later. Maybe. I think it is later. But this is a time in which the making of these dresses is really a consideration, not necessarily for people of Stein's sensibility, experience, or even ideology, but it is certainly in the air for an intellectual. Dave, you want to run with that? I bought you a little time.
Sure. I would just say that the gears of this machinery are oiled with the blood of our brother and sister proletariats.
You would just say that. The conditions of manufacture. Here's my Marxist paraphrase of the poem, and I don't mean I don't mean this necessarily. The conditions of manufacture must be disclosed if a full, complete depiction of fashion is to be truly realistic or realist. How do you like that? All right, so the long line is, what are some options for the long line? We can go to metapoetic in a second, Amaris, but long line, anybody?
Well, the long line of the dress.
The long line as in the style of the dress. Keep going.
The kind of vertical integration of making.
Vertical
dress.
integration, that's a fancy word. But what about the line, the assembly line, the manufacture line, the long line? This is a really long line. There's a long to be disclosed history. If you really want to, so now let's do the metapoetic analogy, because I don't think ultimately Stein is primarily interested in disclosing the conditions of manufacture, but she could be interested in disclosing the conditions of manufacture of meaning.
Exactly.
Go for it. You're on.
Well, the way I interpreted it was that the current is the motion or the movement of meaning that brings a sentence to life. And I wrote that in terms of sound and in terms of meaning, because she says that makes it crackle. And it seems that language in its current form has limitations. Unnecessary waste alludes to that. And she's trying to get outside those limitations into a language that is free, perhaps of the long line of tradition that she alludes to in the first.
A long line of tradition. What about these long lines? It's a prose poem, which we always think of as a poem.
But it's questioning, the lines are of different length. What is this current? Does not end as it normally would with the question mark, so the punctuation is questionable as well.
Terrific. Let's conclude. We haven't done a full reading of this prose poem, but fine. There's much more that can be said, but let's conclude by spending a little more time on the long line of this prose poem. What does the phrase mean in terms of the form of this poem or of any of the tender buttons? Just start us off. I don't expect a brilliant thing to start with. Anna, take a shot.
Well, for me, the long line is pretty self-referential. And then if you look down, like we have the long line in that kind of first, I guess we can call that a stanza. And then if you look down, a line distinguishes it, a line just distinguishes it.
A line distinguishes it. A line just distinguishes it. What does that do?
So if we think kind of meta-poetically, one of the main distinguishing features of verse versus prose is that verse is broken into lines.
Yes.
And maybe
A
shorter
line distinguishes it. That's so nice. Ron Silliman, much later in our course in Chapter 9, is going to talk about the new sentence. And a lot of his, according to George Hartley and a couple of other people who've thought about this lineage, this line, the new sentence begins with Gertrude Stein, who focuses on the sentence as a unit of meaning as opposed to the verse line. So a line distinguishes it being not poetry overall, but this poetry. That's really terrific. So, the tender buttons are really an urgent referentiality. She wants to refer. She just doesn't want to do representational work necessarily in a traditional sense, but she wants reference. So we would be fine talking about this as a long dress. But we are also meant to think of the conditions that are essentially based on linguistic assumptions and other assumptions that keeps behind the scenes the machinery that creates the dress and takes loveliness, serene loveliness as the product, but doesn't look under the hood. And we need to do the same with language. It's a radical project. And it gets past imagism because it's not just interested in the presentation of the image, but in fact a whole history of the way in which the image got constructed linguistically.